Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Anti-Imperialist Scholars Collective podcast and our new theme music, which caught me off guard as well. My name is Navid Farnia. I'm a member of AISC, and today we're joined by Abby Sene, who's also a member of AISC, and we're going to be discussing Mali. The title of our episode today is "The War on Mali: Colonialism to Imperialism." Before we do get into the discussion, Sene asked me, as usual, to ask you all to like and subscribe to our page. East is a podcast listeners, welcome to our page. Please do like and subscribe. Sene also informed me that East is a podcast. They're kicking us off after today, so no more splitting and sharing with them. So please do sign up, for our page, the ACE podcast. And so I'm glad I got that out of the way. Sene won't give me the podcast re-education camp or anything. So okay, so Abby, welcome today. Again, we're going to talk about Mali. There's been a lot going on in the last couple of weeks. I have several questions that we can discuss. But before we get to that, do you want to sort of briefly explain for the audience your background, your experience in Mali, and what you're bringing to this conversation, and to help us set up? And then from there, we can get into the what's going on and some of the historical context as well.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Navid, for inviting me on. I'm also a member of ACE, as you pointed out. So I am Abby Sene, and my relationship with Mali and really AES in general is that I spent most of my my childhood, but also formative years throughout the three countries of the Sahel, that is Mali, Burkina, and Niger. I spent most of my time in Burkina, but also in Mali. In Mali, I was there in the 90s, particularly right after, the coup d'etat in 1991 that ousted President Moussa Traoré, and the subsequent wave of structural adjustment programs, but also deep political fragmentation that happened under the banner of multicultural democracy. And so I've witnessed much of that, and some of that experiences has somewhat informed some of these, what I'm going to present today to you all as well. So I've lived in Mali. I'm originally from Senegal, by the way, and I've moved back to Senegal, but still continue to visit and maintain relationship with people in Mali, Burkina, and Niger as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Abby. And so, yeah, let's get into some of the discussions, and really starting off with what's going on in Mali, what's been happening in the last couple of weeks. What is the current situation? I believe recently the President Assimi Goïta also assumed the position of
Yes.
defense minister as well, after the defense minister Sadio Kamara was assassinated in the offensive a couple weeks ago. So can you just explain, what's been happening, what's at
Yeah.
stake? What are the implications here?
Yeah, of course. So, let's start with just what happened on April 25th. I think most of the audience now have a good understanding of what transpired. It was a large-scale attack, about 15,000 men estimated. It was a joint attack between Janim, which is the Al-Qaeda branch of the Sahel and also Northern Maghreb, and the FLA, which is the Front de Libération de Azawad. And we'll talk a little bit more about Azawad in a little bit. But FLA formed probably about 2 or 3 years ago. It actually broke off from MNLA, which was another coalition of Tuareg rebellion, right? Tuareg nationalist and separatist group. So they broke off and then formed FLA later on. But it was a joint coordination between Janim and FLA in different regions of Mali, including Gao, Mopti, Ségou, and Kidal, right? So Kidal is really, I would say, the epicenter, including Tombouctou as well. But Kidal is really very symbolic for FLA and the separatist movement. And so there were, it was, simply put, there are decapitation strikes, right? With the assassination of Sadio Camara through a suicide bombing. But there was also attack at mosque, right? Like, people are not talking about that, but Sadio Camara was assassinated along his wife and his 2 children. Right, it was a large-scale decapitation strike. It was also an attempted assassination of Assimi Goïta, which did not wasn't successful, thankfully. But Sadio Camara, we have to say, is really the mastermind behind Mali military alignment and strengthening as well, and also their rapprochement with the Russian coalition. And so eliminating Sadio Camara had a lot of symbolism as well, right? It was also he ended up turning into this martyr, ascended to martyrdom, because he's widely now popular and very much exalted within popular discourses, not just in Mali, but across West Africa. So, the outcomes of it now is that FAMA, which is the Force Armée Malienne, so it's the military Malian military force, regained control of almost all territories except for Kidal, right? Kidal is still occupied by mercenaries, but FAMA, Africa Corps, and also the AES, thank you for bringing that map, Sene. So it's, Kidal is right here at the border of Algeria, right? So they have, they're engaging right now into joint attack, have joint forces. AES, Africa Corps, and FAMA have joint forces right now to fight in Kidal and to push off the rebel army. So it's not that, contrary to what headlines are saying, it is not that Kidal is occupied, right? Like they've not regained full control, but they're fighting back to push them out, right? And Africa Corps has made a comeback with FAMA, and now they've been joined with the AES military coalition. But there have been some events that led up to this, right? There's been a series of assaults to destabilize the region and collapse of the AES government. So Mali especially has been the epicenter of these sustained assaults, right? Before, all throughout last year, Janim has imposed some blockade of Mali's major cities, including fuel blockade, which have been successfully pushed off by FAMA last year. There's also been an attack at the Niger uranium storage facility. I think it was either in February or March. I can't remember exactly when, but it was earlier this year when there was a large-scale attack on Niger's uranium storage facility, which were stored at the airport in Niamey. But even a week before April 25th attack, there were confrontations between FAMA and Janim at the border of Mauritania. Right, FAMA entered Mauritanian territory to push back Janim, because that is also important. Mauritania is also a place where Janim and these terrorist groups have also been able to regroup and also rearm as well. And so to even call that FAMA pushing them at the Mauritanian border, French media was all up in arms saying that, that FAMA had basically violated Mauritanian sovereignty, which wasn't the case, right? It was, they're engaged in battle. And then also there was also the French media platforming of opposition leaders throughout the whole week, right? Before and after the attack. And also after that, the celebratory sort of headlines that we've seen all throughout French media. Right, so this one really had the hallmark of what we had seen in some way, what transpired later in 2024 in Syria. Like, it was so clear that it was an attempt to take down the Malian government and then place in a separatist movement, terrorist group within the ranks of the Malian government as well. But that it didn't succeed. And so those were the events. And you asked what are at stakes. And so this is where I like to zoom out and sort of think about 3 forces in motion, right, that have created the conditions of such nonstop assault on AES countries, and Mali especially, right? There is, first of all, the AES struggle for sovereignty, right? Second, there's a crisis of capitalism in the imperialist core. And then the third force in motion, which I'll talk about in a little bit, right, is what I consider to be class interests that are incarnated by the Tuareg nationalist and separatist movement, right? For me, those are class interests, and I'll explain why, right? So there are class interests that were ossified by the French colonial project, right? And so these are continuously reactivated to basically draw a wedge or to assault again Mali's sovereignty time and time again. And so talking really quickly about, I just wanted to talk about, describe what I mean by AES struggle for liberation and sovereignty, right? It is really a struggle that is completely changing the geopolitical and economic landscape of West Africa, right? They have retaken control over their natural resources. Some of them have nationalized even some of their mining resources. We've seen not too long ago a report that for the first time ever, Burkina Faso, for example, has and you're gonna have to help me with this word because I'm not an economist, but they had a trade excess, right? Like, so they actually
surplus, yeah.
Surplus, there we go, trade surplus. The word will escape me. And that's because they've actually been able to not only sell more gold than they have in the past, but they've been able to recapture some of that gold as well. So they've been able to export more than they've imported. And so that is, I mean, in the history of Burkina Faso, that's actually quite significant. Right. And so they're all of a sudden challenging the current French economic domination through talks about breaking from the monetary system, which Mali has done, by the way, in the 1960s, but it's not talked about. Mali was actually a major force before even talks of breaking away from the CFA franc, which is the current West African currency system, right? Mali, since the 1960s, has always been at the forefront of that, and that kind of get lost. But also another one, right? Like challenging French economic domination. The other thing that I would also talk about is that they have been able to build a successful regional security framework that is outside of the Western imposed model. Right. And it is one that other countries are able to emulate. I mean, we're already seeing AES joint forces right now that are very active in Kidal, but also in Mauritania, at the border of Mauritania just a week ago. And that is a huge blow to French imperialism because military agreement was a pillar, right? It has always been for almost 60 years a pillar of French domination in West Africa. Right, this sovereign model of regional security, right, is basically pushing French imperialism out of their territories. Like I said, because these military agreement was a hallmark of French imperialism there. And so you have this fight for sovereignty. The other force that I talked about was the crisis of imperialism, right? Like the deepening crisis of capitalism in the imperial course. Since the last decade, as we've seen, there's been sort of a relaunch of primitive accumulation through means of genocidal wars. I mean, we're seeing that in West Asia right now, but also destabilization campaigns, right? And for France in particular, the energy crisis that is caused by the US NATO-led wars in Russia and now in Iran has been a major factor in their attempt to maintain control over the Sahel, right? Because about 75% of France's electricity is generated through nuclear power. And there are also talks of rearmaments too, right? And so Niger is one of the largest producer of uranium. And the French company, which was at the time called Areva, was a major owner of those mines, right? The French corporation, but also Canadian corporations have created these enclave economies within Niger, but also, mining and gold mining in the south of Mali. So there's a lot at stake for France, but Europe in general. And then there's also other corporations such as Total Energy, for example, is another one. Lafarge, which is also a French company, by the way, which is a cement producer, which was I think it was about a week ago, there are reports that Lafarge was now indicted in this long trial accused of helping or funding ISIS or Al-Qaeda, no, ISIS, I believe, in West Asia. So that's one, right? And there's also Bolloré Group, which is a monopoly it's a conglomerate that controls the ports around West Africa, right? But also because they're able to control the ports, they're also able to control and profit of very important trade routes within West Africa. And as we know, those three countries, AES, are basically, landlocked, right? So they're able to exert some of their control over that region. And so there's quite a lot of stake, again, with the deepening crisis of capitalism in the imperial core that is causing, right, France to continue its, all of these forms of assault in order to maintain control over resources. And so, as I was saying earlier, you have sovereignty, right? The struggle for sovereignty. Now you have the deepening crisis of capitalism. And there's now that third force in motion, as I was saying, that is brought in to serve imperialist interests against sovereignty, to assault their sovereignty, and that is the class interest that was ossified by the colonial process, and are now intensified, or you could even say reactivated by imperialist powers to assault the project of sovereignty and their long aim at regional balkanization, and to bring the Sahel back into the fold of imperialism and subject its economies in service of, accumulation, capitalist accumulation. And so, those are something that I wanted to draw. I know I've talked quite a bit, and we can move on to another question, but I just wanted to say this really fast because it's been really some terrible analysis that have come out over the last week. Not just over the last week, but for decades of knowledge production around the Tuareg, right? That doesn't take into consideration this class interest aspect, right? So these Western analysts on the Tuareg nationalist movement, right, often follows two typical lines. There's the ideological lines or the ideological questions, for example, that kind of bring in the nationalist question and the Islamic question. And then the second line is just, a state-sanctioned deprivation of the northern region by Mali, right? The Malian government, or accusing Malian government of neglecting the north, intentionally neglecting the north, right? That has fueled this Tuareg movement. What is rarely discussed, however, is how the Tuareg movement is ultimately a movement along class lines, right? To serve a specific class interest within the Tuareg community. Because the Tuareg are not a unified front, right, behind this nationalist project. And I think that's very important to say. They're simply not a unified front. Even within the nationalist project, there are already rifts that are coming together, right? Like that's how the FLA broke off, or MNLA broke off and then joined, and then it sort of spin off into the FLA. So there are already these tensions within these nationalist movement. But even as a whole, the Tuareg community, as I was saying, is not. So there are many Tuaregs. I have a student who's Tuareg herself and did this beautiful, project on Mali cultural heritage, right? So there are many other Tuareg, including those who are incorporated into Mali's army, but also Mali's government, Mali's civil society, right, who actually pledge allegiance to Mali rather than to this nationalist project, right? Like who feel like their sense of nationality actually outweighs their, supersedes their ethnicity, their belonging to the Tuareg identity. And so, we have to ask, like, whose class interest in Mali does this nationalist project serve, right? Like, who is really behind, pushing behind this nationalist project that we have seen through FLA, FLA that joined hands with Janine in order to, attack Mali. Like, whose class interest is it serving? It really serves a minority elite Tuareg, right, who during the colonial period accumulated land and property, including cattle and also indentured labor, right? They accumulated land and property through a feudal system based on lineage and caste division of labor, right? It is a system which was instrumentalized by the French colonizers, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a little bit, right, to achieve their aim of domination and capitalist production. So, the ideological question and the regional disparities between the North and the South, right, are part of these issues, but focusing solely on these dialogues, right, always this narrative dislodges the structural analysis of imperialism and also capitalist production. Like, it's very rare to read even an analysis that traces, for example, the Tuareg rebellions in relation to post-colonial state land reforms and capitalist development. So in fact, like, a majority of anxiety that pushed towards the rebellions in the 60s and also in the 90s were land reforms, right? And so I'm just going to pause there and then see if you have any other questions.
Yeah, absolutely. That was excellent. Thank you very much. And I'm glad that you brought up, for instance, this issue, this project really of balkanization. This is really an attempt at what I see as the balkanization of Mali. And specifically, if we think about, like, for example, others have said this, you said this as well, right? We're talking about 15,000 fighters who waged this offensive.
Yeah.
That is not like a conventional, like, quote unquote terrorist attack. That is a large scale offensive meant to overthrow the government. And so if it was as simple as, like, if it was just the PLA, right, and it was their separatist ambitions, why would this offensive go all the way to the capital? Why would they assassinate the defense minister, right? Do these things? But no, instead they actually aligned themselves, a convergence of interests, I guess, with Janine. And it seems like Janine's project was to take over the Malian state, and in doing so, the PLA could perhaps fulfill its separatist ambitions as well, right? And therefore, this balkanization would serve the interest of imperialism, because then France and the United States could siphon the resources once again.
Absolutely.
In both like of these smaller states that would come out of the project, right? So I'm glad that you brought this up. And I think part of this discussion also then leads us into diving into, like, the history of colonialism in Mali. And so if we think about the long history of Mali and the French colonialism in West and North Africa, my question for you is, what are the historical factors and processes that are now reverberating in Mali and the region today? I think you talked about this a little bit, but really just, explain in greater detail how we got here.
Yeah, sure. And this is actually a part where I would love to see that map that I believe was either Sene or Diego put up earlier, because Mali is actually the largest West African state, right? The largest country. And so having a map and really helps in sort of locating some of those historical factors. I don't know if he's able to bring that up. If not, that's okay. I mean, I can still, oh, there it is. Perfect. Okay, so I think we need to start at the precipice, which is the capture of Samori Touré. Samori Touré, by the way, was the founder of the Manding Empire, but he was also a Manding general who fought fiercely for 18 years, put up a guerrilla warfare against French domination, right? And so in 1988, when the French were finally able to capture Samori Touré, which was right around.
I believe it's 1888, right?
I'm sorry, 1990. Thank you. 1898. Yes. So 1898, it was the capture of Samori Touré after 18 years of guerrilla warfare to resist French colonial occupation. they were able to penetrate the territory, right? And so moving upwards all the way to this area here where we call the Niger Bend. And if you look at this area, I don't know if you all can see my mouse, but moving, but it was right in the middle here where you see Mopti, right, and then right up where you have the Niger River, which is the largest river in West Africa, sort of bends, curve. That's the area that we refer to as the Niger Bend. It is probably the most fertile, if not the most fertile sort of region in the country, and that's very important in terms of land holdings, but also land struggle over land, right? But it was also one of the hardest territory for the French to dominate. Why? Because this is where there are several ethnic groups in Mali, including the Tuareg, whom I've already talked to. The Tuareg are predominantly in the north, but they also occupied much of the regions here around the Niger Bend. But it was one of the hardest places for the French to dominate, because this is where all of the different groups sort of converge, right? That includes the Fulani, the Bambara, Tuareg, Arab, Bozo, Soninke, Sorai, and and also some of the Tuareg, all converged within that small area there. And so the difficulty of controlling this area with the diversity of people that live there led to a French form alliance with some of the groups to more effectively conquer the territory. So in their alliance, the French in order to strengthen, in their alliance with local groups, the French strengthened and institutionalized customer laws from which certain groups drew a lot of their political and economic power, but it also marginalized others. So the Tuareg, who at first resisted French domination, became major allies of the French beginning in the 1920s, and basically helped the French bring other groups into the fold of French colonialism, so that they were able to control the Niger Bend region, right? And so the strengthening of those customary laws, which was mostly a feudal system, I mean, that's basically all it is. It was a feudalism right around the Niger Bend at the curve, but also in the northern region, right? Strengthening of that feudal system, were able to bring the Tuareg noble class into an alliance with the French. So not only did the French ally protected the Tuareg in the colonial looting and conquest, but they also exalted the Tuareg identity in some of their public discourses. I mean, there are plenty of essays by French generals and explorers and anthropologists who write about the Tuareg as being the closest to Europeans. So there's always that racial question as well. They're lighter skinned, as compared to other, more of their black skin, darker skin counterparts in the South, where the Bambara are. And so some of these anthropologists, French explorers and anthropologists, even compare the Tuareg to some of they refer to them as the cousins of the Gauls. And if you know the Gauls, they were also a nomadic, group in France that also fought other groups during before French empire expanded to West Africa. And so they compared them with the French, with basically cousins of the French. But one thing that we need to also remember is that the Tuareg social and political organization is based on feudalism, right? And still today, they're organizing confederacies still today, right? And their social hierarchies are based on lineage, but also racial ideas that were imported and reified by the French own ideas of race, right? Racial lines. So the ones who occupied the bottom of the hierarchy have darker skin, but were also held by those of noble lineage under a slaveholding custody type of system. It was basically a slave system. But I also, even though it was a slavery system, I have to stress that at that time, those who were held as slaves were not used for wealth or capitalist production, as you would see with the transatlantic the devastating transatlantic system, but they were made to live in their master's household or in semi-autonomous villages through the feudal system. And if Claude Messaillou, who was a French anthropologist with Marxist interpretation of the social and political organization of the Sahelian state, has written on that slavery system, if you all are more interested in it, and have confirmed that this was very distinct from the capitalist system of slavery. And Sheikh Anta Diop also wrote on the caste system and social organizations of those Sahelian societies. And so one thing that's also important to stress is that, under this form of feudal slavery system, right, slave could own property, including small pieces of land and cattle. But when they died, the master took over ownership, right, of that land and cattle as well. And this way, the noble class was able to amass like massive property and land across all Tuareg confederacies. And so the French colonial state imported their own ideas of race to reinforce and expand these social hierarchies. And in true bourgeois liberalism, they defended the social hierarchies that reinforcing customary rules that give power to chiefs, to traditional chiefs, among which were the Tuareg of noble lineage, but they also expanded the number of people who actually fell under slaveholding custody. And the reason why that is, Mali, Samir Amin wrote in 1972, I think, The Underdevelopment of Black Africa, where he sort of, I don't know, you may have read it, Navid, but who talked about the incorporation of these different regions of Africa into the global capitalist system, and that in West Africa, along the coastal, lines, was mostly a plantation system. It was somewhat the same in those three countries, Mali, Burkina, and Niger, but it was slightly different because it was also a labor pool to work on the plantations along the coast. So you see a lot of people from Mali who were taken to the coast of, to Senegal, for example, to work on like peanut plantations. You'll have people from Burkina who were taken down to Ivory Coast as well to work on cocoa farms and so on and so forth, right? And so their integration into the global capitalist system was very different. That region really served as a labor pool. And so that labor pool was also why, the question of labor to serve for capitalist production was also why those social hierarchies were somewhat, ossified by the colonial project and expanded so that they were able to bring in more people to work on those plantations under the feudal system. So in the 1930s through the 40s, once the French consolidated their power and had less needs to defend customary chiefs and their indigenous alliance, right? This was also a time, at the same time, as World War II. I like how Dr. Pierre Jamimia talks about it as a European Civil War. So I'll call it a European Civil War as well, right? Which the colonial center were really preoccupied with, sort of opened the door for people in the Niger band who were held in captivity by the slave system, the feudal slave system, to join forces, to fight back and to free themselves. And they also merged struggle with the waves of anti-colonial movement that were brewing in the southern part of Mali. Right. And so during the movements for decolonization, which were led by Modibo Keïta, among others in the petty bourgeois class that were educated in France, made the abolition of this feudal system a central issue of this campaign towards decolonization, and also for an independent Mali that was free of like oppressive racial ideas, which the French played a major role in reinforcing and expanding. But there were also questions around which group should lead the nation state, right? That question became central to the project of decolonization, right? And also how they envision an independent Mali? Should Mali be incorporated into a federation? Or should it be broken out? I mean, there are all those questions that animated some of these, the project of decolonization. But it's important, I don't want to spend too much time on that, but it's important to say that the Arabization of some group, but not others, right? And the question of caste and ethnic hierarchies, particularly in the North, were intensified, which were intensified and instrumentalized by the French, animated some of these larger questions around who should and should not lead independent Mali. And so there was, for example, this vocal and powerful section of the Tuareg, the elite section that were able to amass so much land through that feudal system, who were opposed to Mali being led by a non-Tuareg, non-Arabized, social group. I mean, Modibo Keita was the leader of the decolonial movement, and he was Bambara, right? And so at the same time, they also pushed for a modernization project of their confederacies that allowed them to assimilate to the French, or they had aspiration for French assimilation, right? But also assimilation with other Arab nations in North Africa, right? But the way they envision it, this modernization project, right, is also, they saw northern Mali as an autonomous territory, right? But that autonomous territory also included the Niger Band. And if you recall what I was saying, the Niger Band include other ethnic groups. It wasn't just the Tuareg, including the Songhai who still have important land holdings right around and land claims around the Niger Band, right? They practice agriculture. They're not nomadic. They're a sedentary group. And so to have that northern section be completely autonomous, and then led by a feudal, through a feudal system led by a Tuareg noble group, where does that leave off the Songhai and other ethnic groups that actually had land? And so it was that proposal of a Tuareg territory, which is now called Azawad, but even Azawad is just a utopia, right? But that's really the genesis of Azawad. It was put into proposal in 1952 into the French parliamentary, right? At that time, the French were not interested in the proposal until the discovery of an oil and gas in the region, right? And so that piqued their interest. And so the French passed a law that is called the Organisation des Communes des Régions Sahariennes. So it's the organization of Saharian communities, right? A region of Saharian communities, which gave autonomy to northern Mali, right? So in their mind, the French saw that as an opportunity to basically create a vassal state, right? With feudal monarchies that are very similar to what we're seeing now with the Gulf nations, what the British established in West Asia. But it also disintegrated the territorial integrity of Mali at a time where the Mali independence movement was actually seeking to form a federation of West African states, which included Guinea, it included Senegal as well, right? They were really pushing for a federation, which the French were completely opposed to. They wanted them basically to assimilate to the French, join the French community where they could assimilate so that they could gain, keep them under control. And so shortly after independence, Modibo Keita abolished, customary laws that from which, the Tuareg drew their power. And so this move, which, was really for the Tuareg, anyway, they saw that move when Modibo Keita abolished those customary laws and abolished slavery and all of those, they saw that as a threat to their own autonomy, right, the Tuareg. But they also saw that as a threat as the Mali attempting to basically, the Malian government trying to alienate them, right? But there was also the fear of land reforms, which became a major source of grievance. So in 1962, Modibo Keita withdrew Mali from the OCRS. OCRS is what I was saying, the Organisation des Communes des Régions Sahariennes, which created this vassal state in the northern Mali by the French. And so when they withdrew from that, these grievances fueled the first wave of the Tuareg rebellions, which occurred from 1962 to 1964. That was 2 years, right, after Mali gained independence in 1960. And so there's been like 4 major Tuareg rebellions. I guess we could call this last one the Tuareg, Tuareg rebellion. But the major Tuareg rebellions really, I would say, occurred during inflection points in Mali neo-colonial history at moment of like political and economic upheaval. So you had 1962, shortly after independence, right? Then you had 1991 during the coup d'etat against Moussa Traoré. Moussa Traoré was actually resisting military agreements that the French were trying to impose in them. And then 1991 all the way down, you had structural adjustment plan. The third one was in 2012. I'm talking about the Tuareg Rebellion, which was also came shortly right before the coup d'etat against Amadou Toumani Touré as well. And so now you have this one today. So, I know I've said a lot, so I'm going to,
Yeah.
This
is all like, obviously it's very, very important history. And it actually leads me into my next question. We do have questions about, Russia and Algeria, and I promise the audience we're going to get to those as well. I also want to say, again, like, following Sene's instructions, please do like and subscribe to our podcast. East of the podcast listeners, especially, please do like and subscribe, and join our network or whatever you want to call us. But yeah, before we get to Russia and Algeria, like the questions that some people have, we're gonna talk about AES as well. We'll talk about ECOWAS. I'm sure you have things to say about all of these, Abby. But I want to talk a little bit more about the French, right? So because there's a reason why, like why we framed this event around French colonialism and imperialism, right? So the question is, what is France's role in Mali? And again, you've talked about this already. So maybe you want to elaborate a little bit more. But one of the things I want to sort of emphasize is something that you said earlier, with respect to France's historical control over the region's resources, right? And so there's a reason why the AES in states like Burkina Faso are not only nationalizing like their gold and their mining industries, but they're also developing like tomato processing plants and cashew processing plants for the first time. Developing the detergent factory, like I think the first one that exists in independent Africa, and that's important and it's notable because one of the resources that was siphoned under French colonialism from West Africa was palm oil. Palm oil is one of the central ingredients of detergent, right? And so, again, this all speaks to France's nefarious role here, right? Like, what is it trying to do? But even beyond that, and I think perhaps a more complex question is really, what is the U.S.'s role here, right? So in what ways is the United States working to destabilize Mali, the AES, and the broader region?
Yeah. Okay. So let me talk about, I love this one. Last, nothing good comes from, that is so true, by Usman Sembène. Okay. So, U.S.'s role, people always recognize the fall of Libya as the, by, I would say, the U.S. NATO-led assault against Libya's, which resulted in the assassination of Gaddafi, right? They associate that point in time as the period of complete destabilization of the region in which the U.S. had a very concrete role. But I would actually say it started well before that. And this is where also Algeria comes into the picture, because I know there are questions about Algeria as well. Like, the war on terror, I think it was in around 2000, 2004, right? U.S. Special Forces entered the picture around 2003 through agreement with Algeria, which had came out. Algeria had just come out of a civil war. There were already rebel groups within, factions within Algeria as well, and so because of that, Algeria invited and signed agreement with the U.S. under this larger umbrella of counterterrorism, the war on terror. That was right after 9/11. And so Algeria and the U.S. signed several military agreements within, this umbrella of the war on terror, including one that was called, I think it's the Pan-Sahel Initiative and Trans-Saharan Counterterrorism. That was an agreement that was signed between Algeria and the U.S. and that lasted from 2002 to 2005. At the same time, shortly after that, right? So you have Al Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, which is called Akim, right? Which is very active still today. Originated from Algeria's militant group. It was a Salafist militant group. In French, the labels are GSPC. I'm not quite sure what exactly those stand for, but Akim originated from Algeria's Salafist militant group and was formed in 1998, but it was formally affiliated with Al Qaeda in 2006, and that was right after U.S. entered into the picture, right? They entered into the picture and there were some, several occurrences. This is when really all of these hostage taking and then payment of ransom, they started taking hostages of Westerners that lived in Algeria, Westerners that lived in Mali, and all of that. Like all of these hostage taking, the activities of terrorist groups actually started going up. And go figure, this was exactly why the U.S. Special Forces came into the picture. I mean, people.
And I believe like AFRICOM was created in 2007, so right around there, right? So
that's it exactly. I'm glad you reminded that. Right. So it was really once the U.S. entered into the picture through their war on terror, counterterrorism initiative, that actually terrorist groups started forming and proliferating in that space. And so, but, going back to Libya had, during the drought of the 1980s in the Sahel region, a lot of the people who lived in the north, the Tuareg that lived in the north, migrated towards Algeria. They migrated towards Libya as well in better, in search of better pastures. When they migrated, because they migrated to Algeria, they were also integrated into some of these, militant groups during the Algerian Civil War. But also when they migrated into Libya, some of these Tuareg who used to live in Mali, right, and also Niger, were incorporated by Gaddafi into its paramilitary group, right? They were integrated into Libyan society. So after the fall of Libya, this is when things started really cascading, because the Tuareg left Libya and then went down and then started, that was when the coup in 2012 and the rebellion also started as well. So, I mean, you could clearly see the patterns. It's like there's a logic. You're following the U.S. enters the scene through its counterterrorism, campaign, and terrorism actually picks up. Go figure. Libya falls, and then this is also a thing, like it started to cascade as well. And so, that's really U.S. broad role. And I'm sure today, I mean, we see them very active in Nigeria as well. So there's definitely U.S. interest in that region, even though they've not come out forcefully into the picture, AES picture yet. Have no doubt, I'm talking Mali specifically, because the French right now are really leading that front, that imperialist front. But make no mistake that, the U.S. have no qualm about entering the front. I think right now they're bogged down into so many other imperialist wars, but the French are really leading that imperialist front.
So
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So I want to jump in there as well, because now I feel like it's a good time to also bring Russia into this conversation, because
Yes.
part of the attacks on Mali have been in many respects executed with the assistance of Ukraine, right?
Yes.
So I know, like, on another podcast, David Hundayan has talked about how all these wars are really part of different fronts in a larger war, right? So
Yeah.
whether it's in Ukraine, whether it's in West Asia, whether it's in Sudan, like the most, he mentioned that the most fronts that exist in this larger global war are actually on the African continent. And I think that's the correct analysis,
Yeah.
right? That we need to understand, like, why is it that Ukraine is coordinating with Janim, right? Like, what is, like, what are the connections there, right? And
Yeah.
so, I guess here we can talk a little bit about, like, the question is, like, psychological warfare. There's this effort to create, like, widespread confusion in regarding what's happening in Mali. And we talked about Syria, we talked about Libya, right? And it's kind of like along those lines, the psychological war. And it also involves, like, what is Russia's involvement? Is Russia going to,
Yeah.
withdraw? Like, I mean, there were already false reports coming out about Russia withdrawing its troops from the country
It's
at the
back
time.
and forth. It's
Yeah,
still
yeah.
very
So
active
yeah,
in
so
Mali.
can you dispel some of these myths that we heard with respect to Mali and its military, and other actors? You mentioned Algeria, but of course Russia as well.
Yeah. So let me just say something about Algeria really fast,
Mhm.
and then I'll go into Russia. So the timing of this attack, which is April 25th, you can't help and think, okay, this was clearly coordinated, and aligned with that timing, with that event, is Mali's recognition of Morocco's autonomy over the Western Sahara. And part of the reason, a big motivation of for Mali to recognize the Western Sahara is that it is a landlocked country and needs access, maritime access, and which Morocco has been very engaged courting AES, right? Not just Mali, but AES countries in general, giving them maritime access exactly for that recognition. So Morocco has really worked for that recognition right here. And so with the timing of the attack right after that, there are a lot of speculation that Polisario, which is the Western Sahara, Liberation Front, was behind some of these attacks. And, things are still foggy. And I just want to caution folks, to be careful around some of that, because I think there is a concerted effort by the French to intensify regional tensions. There's clearly a tension right now between Algeria and Mali for different reasons, because Mali has, like, for very good reasons, which I don't think we have time to go over, but well-founded reasons to believe that Algeria is hosting terrorist base on its, right there at the southern region. But I don't think that Algeria has been as active in this specific attack. Like, I'll just say that right now. I think some of it is really psyop, and I think that it is in the interest. Like, French doesn't have any interest at all. It is against French's interest to have Mali and Algeria unified front, because even Algeria's relationship with France right now is also at an all-time low. Right, the French and the Algerians have really butted head over the past few years, and so having also Mali against France, it makes a lot of sense to have them unified, and so there's a lot of effort right now to intensify that tension between, through French media, between Algeria and Mali. So that's all I wanted to bring out regarding that. And also, I was going to say, while France has not come out and put out a statement condemning at all, right, the accusation, Algeria has,
Yes,
right?
yes, absolutely, yeah. And I
Right.
think
I
that's
think we
important
need
to
to
point.
be right. They've come right out and then actually lended their support and solidarity with the Malian army, the Malian government, which not even Ivory Coast has done that. Ivory Coast has tried to stay clear, which they've also been accused of destabilizing AES. And so I think that's important to bring up, that Algeria has come out to condemn the attacks. Now, the other one, your question about Russia, we need.
Actually, Abby, before we answer that question, Sina has a clip he wants us to show of
Is that where? Oh, I recognize this. I've seen this one on social media.
Yes. So yeah, that is a clip of Russia and Russia in coordination with the Malian armed forces
and AES too.
Yes, AES as well.
Because
exactly.
AES, on April 25th, everyone was like, well, where's this big mighty army coalition that they formed? But they responded the very next day. So Russia African Corps is still there. They're fighting alongside FAMA, and they're fighting alongside AES as well. So let me just clarify a few things. Why Russia even entered into the picture. It is really the arrogance of the French, their racism, right? Their condescending attitudes towards Mali and other West Africans, Africans in general, right? That really propelled these three governments to reevaluate their relationship with the French government. Number one, when they were, and I'm going to give you a very specific example. The French army has been very unreliable. Like French military has been very unreliable partner in West Africa. And Chad, let me bring up Chad really quickly, because Chad, Faustin Taoudoué, who was the French, who was put into power by France in 2015, was also facing a wave of Tuareg rebellion within its own territory. He came into power in 2015 with the help of France, and they signed a deal, right? Like he announced that he's going into a military agreement with France, right? It was called, I think, Opération Sangakariste. Opération Sangakariste invited the French to also help them fight off or quell some of these Tuareg rebellion, and then also other terrorist groups. And then the next, after Faustin took office, a couple of months later, they withdraw the agreement publicly. Didn't even tell the government. I mean, I'm talking about the French. I remember Hollande made this public announcement saying that they're reevaluating their relation, they're withdrawing their relation, that agreement, and have not even bothered to consult Taoudoué, who they put into office at that time. And so that's the kind of relationship. And then also having no-fly zones. When the French were there, having no-fly zones within their own territory, like they basically had no sovereignty over their territory at all. When the French were there, they weren't even arming them properly, right? There are a lot of social media video, and I remember that France, nothing good comes of it. Exactly. Thank you. So anyway, it's that kind of condensation, and condescending, that part, condescending tone, and the unreliability of the French that just forced these three nations to come together and actually take over, their military and also the government. And so after these three coups happened, the French used ECOWAS to impose sanctions, not just ECOWAS, but also UEMOA, which is the monetary, community, French monetary community, to cut off all of their financial assets and all of that within the region. So they no longer were able to even purchase weapons. Like nobody will sell them weapons because of those sanctions, except for Russia. And that gets lost all the time in the conversation. Russia is in the picture, first of all, because the French were unreliable, but also because it was the only country that was willing to sell weapons and work with those three nations and also sign agreement. And so that has to be very clear. They weren't brought in. I mean, part of it is ideological, but a lot of it was also very much transactional. But it is the French who were humiliated after they got kicked out of that region who insist that they were swapped, traded for the Russians. It was like, oh, they kicked us out to bring in the Russians, but never explained why the Russians came into the picture in the first place. It was because they imposed sanction and nobody else will sell them weapons. And so they went and partnered with the Russians who accepted to work with them. It is as simple and basic as that. It has nothing.
Yes.
It's much more transactional than people make it out to be.
Yes.
And so Sadio Camara, who was decapitated, who was assassinated, was also the mastermind into regaining sovereignty and then actually seek out other alliances with the, including with the Russians, but even with the Iranians and the Turkish as well, right? The Iranians as well. And so he was the mastermind into this restructuration, this realignment, to the point where, and then purchased massive artillery with the Russians, from the Russians. And now Fama has raised into, they've been ranked as the number 1 or number 2, but anyway, they've actually gone up into the rank of the most powerful army in West Africa. And at some point, even superseded Ivory Coast, which was the first one. But now Russia, and all of this is through African Corps, and they were able, something that they never tell you as well, they don't tell you, the French don't tell you, is that with Russia, they recaptured Kidal. Because Kidal, when the French were there, they liberated Kidal in 2012. The terrorist groups reoccupied Kidal in 2020, right shortly after the coup d'etat in Mali. They were able, in 2023, when they entered into agreement with the Russians and were able to build their force, they recaptured Kidal and actually regained most of their territory. But none of it, and even the other Sahel that I see all the time these days is, that, they're making it pitch France against Russia, right, along these two lines. When Russians, but they don't talk about, again, how through the help, the partnership of Russia, Fama, which is the military, Malian military army, was really able to make a resurgence, regain most of its territory, even if yesterday, 2 weeks ago, they had this setback. It was just mostly, I see it like, as the fall of Syria in a way, even though it wasn't a fall, but it was really, they lost the battle, but did not lose the war. They're still there. They're still standing and they're still strong. They're still fighting back. And Russia is still very much present into the region.
Yeah, I appreciate that. That's an excellent way to transition to talking about the AES. There's a couple of things I want to say really quick. First of all, I 100% with respect to Russia. I also want to add that, like, all this infrastructural development that we see, right, like in the AES countries, is also like with the assistance of China as well, right? China is providing like all these tractors and all these things that are going into infrastructural development. And I like that you point out these are transactional relationships, right? Again, pointing to the podcast, I think that David Hundayan did with Jamal Thomas, if I believe. Yeah. He talked about how Russia's like defense assistance to the AES is not meant to be a permanent solution to what's going on.
Exactly.
In the region, right. It's supposed to be sort of like a bridging mechanism until the AES is able to, withstand, like, develop its own defense infrastructure to defend itself, right? And so we need to understand, like, what's going on in the region, Russia's assistance in that vein, and frame it in that way, so that we don't think of it as like the AES cannot defend themselves and they need Russia to come in. And then when Russia doesn't, like, if Russia doesn't succeed, it's because Russia betrayed them or because the AES is inept or whatever, right? That's a very problematic framing, in my opinion. And also, like, as David pointed out, like, it also, Russia has its own war going on, right? Like its own front and on its own border. And so I think that's another reason why we need to understand these wars and these different fronts actually as part of this larger war, right? So, I think I'm really glad that you brought all this into the conversation. The other thing I really quickly want to say is that, this is more of a plug, I guess. But we are going to be continuing this conversation next week. We're going to have another live stream on like the larger AES next week. I believe Abby, you're going to be part of that one as well.
Yes, I am.
Okay, so yeah, so
I've
that's
been voluntold. Just kidding.
yeah, next Friday. Yeah, next Friday, I believe on the 15th. But also we have a special issue coming out this month, later this month, in May, on the AES and Pan-Africanism in general. So, audience members, look out for all these things. Yes, on anti-imperialist.com. We're a little behind on our issues on our blog. We have a special issue coming out on Iran, very, very soon, next week. And then the one after that is going to be on AES and Pan-Africanism. So that brings me to, actually, let me just quickly also say, please, again, like and subscribe so that, Sene doesn't get on my case. Like and subscribe, to our podcast. They're gone. So I have two more questions for you all, for you, Abby, not you all, for you, Abby. The first one is, and we can be brief on this one because we're going to have a larger discussion next week. But what are the implications of all this for the AES, and what is at stake for the region, and why Mali and why now?
Yeah. So I just need to say that first, why Mali? Because it's the largest state, right? But it's also being the one that's always caused the French a problem. Like literally since the 1960s, they've always been, not even since 1898 with Samori Touré, right? They've always resisted French domination. And I think Mali doesn't get enough credit for it, but it's also a vast territory. And so when you have a balkanization project, Mali becomes an automatic target. There's also, these Tuareg separatist movement that is very ripe to be co-opted into this larger project of balkanization. But so here's the, why now? I think that's such a great question because there are currently, if you follow West African regional politics, which I do quite a bit, there's somewhat, you can sense that there's a regional shift in support of AES. And I mean, like, that's including first in Senegal, in my home country, right? There's a lot, I mean, popularly, but even among some of the political class, right, there are massive conversations around, how do we get actually join AES and so on and so forth. So there's a regional shift, right? And that is a threat to those countries that were, even those countries like Benin, for example, which elected a new government, a new, president about a month ago, actually has publicly came out, right, to announce his intention towards mending relations with AES, right? And then remend relations and work with them. When his predecessor, who was Patrice Talon, was a comprador, I mean, he worked for the French basically, right? When he was very active in ECOWAS and imposing some of those sanctions and so on and so forth. His name escaped me, so I do apologize. But this new president of Benin actually signaled that he wants to mend relationship with AES, right? Reevaluate relationship. And that is a threat to the French. Ouattara is starting to warm up a little bit with he's starting to lower, relieve some of those sanctions that they had. But also Togo hosted a summit on April 18th, right, a week before the terrorist attack, that was focused on strengthening regional support and relation with AES. That was completely outside. It was a very different narrative because it was, how do we support AES? How do we work with them, rather than how do we reintegrate AES into the ECOWAS, right? There was a very different shift even in the quality of discourses that was coming out of that summit on April 18th. And so that change in regional change towards warming up towards AES is really a threat to to imperialist powers. And so I think that also somewhat was impetus to launch an attack right away. Yes.
Thank you. And the name, the president, I maybe mispronounced, I probably am, Ramoud Wadanyi is Benin's new president.
Renaud Wagani.
Oh, yeah.
Wagani is his name. Yeah. And
Okay.
people are, I think I'll give him time, but some of his, you, the sovereignty, the economic development plan of AES is now really finding itself, emulated in some of these presidential candidate, programs. And Wagani was one of them. He actually won on a platform that echoed some of that sovereigntist, discourse of AES. And so there is, like I said, there's this regional shift that's starting to emerge.
So this transitions well into the last question I have for you, because I think so. Again, we talked about like this was an attempt to overthrow the government in Mali, and if we frame it in that way, and if we understand it in that way, that it was 15,000 fighters who tried to take over the country. If we frame it in that way, then we understand that it was a failure, because the current government is still in power, right? Assimi Goïta is still in power, and the situation is not totally under control, but largely under control, right? And so part of that is like the court, the Malian Defense Forces, the AES, Russia's Africa Corps, all being able to hold up. But also, I think a major aspect of this, and this is what you're getting to in the last answer, the popular support in the region, but of course, like, and especially within these AES countries themselves, right? The popular support for their governments and for self-determination and sovereignty, right?
Yeah.
With that popular support, like the Malian government would not be able to withstand an imperialist assault, right? And so I think we really need to emphasize that, just as we do with respect to popular support in Iran and Yemen and these places, the countries of the AES, they are popular revolutions. Like, this is what we're talking about, right? And so my last question in this respect is, what is your assessment of the current situation? We do see a lot of these psyops, right? That Mali is about to fall. Of course, that is not going, as you've pointed out, like it seems to be under control. So what do you make of all this, right? Like, and I did mention popular support, but yeah, any other thoughts do you want to add? Like, key things moving forward.
Sure. So let me just say this in terms of popular support, and for Mali specifically, I would say that off of all of those AES countries, Mali may be the only one that is really fighting an existential war. I mean, like, it's been reoccurring every year, every 10 years or so, there's this resurgence of like attacks and assault against Mali. And this is since the 1960s with Modibo Keita's socialist experiments, which this is a nod to Dr. Grolu in the comments, right? That Mali had a socialist experiment, right? And so ever since that, there's been constant assault, but it's also the threat of balkanization, where the north is completely cut off from the south. This is loss of its territorial integrity that will completely end. That would be the end of Mali as a nation state, right, as we know it today. So that will drive a regional fragmentation with competing interests that will facilitate the continued penetration of imperialism. And I think this threat, in my opinion, is real in ways that isn't necessarily in Niger and Burkina. I mean, they're fighting their own assault, but Mali itself, there's a reason why there's this constant resurgence of assault against Mali. Last thing I wanted to say in regards to populist support, and I think this is, thinking about the analysis that came out that always talks about, these governments as the junta, as the military, as authoritarianism. There was this piece that was published by Howard French in Foreign Policy that I just wanted to respond to, right? Because a lot of it hinged on the slip into authoritarianism, right? As if that was really one of the reasons for where Mali is where it is today, right? I just wanted to respond and say that, I actually lived in Mali in the 90s, right? Mali has had 20 years of multi-party democracy with intense political fragmentation among the different political parties. But this was also a time during those, multi-party democracy, right? Their economic liberalization austerity measures. The CFA was devalued in 1994, which I recall vividly. The inflation that happened at that time was just shocking, right? That really led to the immiseration of vast population, even including in the North, right? And there was continuously a wave of student protests, and these students themselves that were completely disenchanted by, completely disillusioned by this multi-party democracy, right? So this is your democracy. This is your liberal democracy, right? That led to the privatization of some of this sphere and the retrenchment of state social programs at the time that, by the way, all of that has culminated into the next decade of Tuareg rebellion. So it's not logical to always talk about authoritarianism, military government, and so on and so forth, right? Like, to say that this is what caused some of these attacks is simply not true, right? That logic does not apply. And so, instead of always asking about, posing questions around military posture, right? Like, this question should not be about military or not versus civil government, right? Or whether it should be electoral democracies in Mali or AES. I think the question that we need to be asking is, what are the popular mandates, and how and at which speed are those mandates being converted into structural changes by those in charge of the government? Whether it's a military government, whether it's a, civil government, like, what are the popular mandates and how are they being integrated or converted into structural change? That is the question that we should be asking. And those question is a question of sovereignty, and nobody can deny that sovereignty in electoral and liberal democracy are always constrained by political conditionalities that are imposed by imperialist institutions, that gives precedence to capitalist accumulation over democratic, inclusive, popular, social, and economic development planning. And that is exactly what happened in the 90s and part of the 2000s in Mali during the multi-party democracy. I mean, sure, there have been some improvements, right, in social condition, but overall, structurally, much of it hasn't changed. It's just polarized accumulation, unequal distribution of resources that have all culminated to the next decade of rebellion. So let's just put that to rest. This whole idea of Mali being a junta, led by a junta, as if you only have a military and government. They're actually civilians. The foreign minister, who actually makes very much, Yakuba Diop, who is one of the leading voices, he would be the equivalent of, is it Ari, the Iranian foreign minister?
Yeah, RLG.
Right? He's actually a civilian. He was in the UN system, right? He's not a military. So the idea that it's a junta, I think that's also a psyop, right? To delegitimize their government. But I also wanted to say, one thing from one of my favorite development economists, Ndika Makandurere, who talks about choiceless democracies. And I'm just going to read this quote. It says, the pertinence of these questions arises because globalization contains within it two contradictory effects on democratization. On the one hand, the opening up of economies and society, the political conditionalities transmitted through global institution, and the solidarity from movement encapsulated in the notion of global civil society are generally supportive of democratization efforts in many countries. On the other hand, the demands of globalization, especially the erosion of national sovereignty and the uniformization of what are considered fundamentals in economic policy, limit the range of policy options for democratic regimes. Those who hold the first part as the dominant effect of globalization consider democracy and economic liberalization as simply two sides of the same coin, the edification of a liberal order, a natural convergence of processes that marks the triumph of liberal capitalist order and the end of democracy. right? Like that is the limit of liberal democracy. And I just wanted to put this entire conversation around military governments to rest because it's extremely reductive when we should be asking other questions. They have popular mandates and they're making structural changes to see that happen. My country of Senegal, which is the hallmark of democracy in West Africa, is actually facing exactly that with the mounting, debt crisis. They can't even, it was a government that was put in there by popular vote, and now they're implementing or forced to implement very unpopular austerity measures that are imposed by the IMF. So this is really the essence of the Western liberal democracy.
Thank you. Yeah, that was really excellent. 100% agree. And that's a good way to wrap up. Before we do, so again, thank you, Abby. This was really, really excellent. Before we do wrap up, again, just one more reminder to our audience: please do like and subscribe. East is a podcast listeners, especially. This is the last time we're going to be sharing with East is a podcast, and then also please do, feel free to contribute to our producers' Patreon, Sene Rahmani. Sene, I don't know if you have your little text ready to show on the screen, but yes, please do contribute to that. Yeah, there you go. So yes, and again, we will be back on Friday of this week. I believe the discussion is going to focus on the Caribbean and the U.S. and the Caribbean again, led by, I believe, Sharice Burton-Stelly and Tamanisha John, and I think there might be a guest for that one as well. And then next week we'll be discussing the AES, the larger AES, in greater detail. And then I believe the week after that we're going to talk about Pan-Africanism. That would be May 22nd. So we have a lot of good stuff coming up, and our blog issue as well. Our Iran issue is coming up soon, probably next week, early next week, and then after that, our special issue on the AES and Pan-Africanism. So thank you all, and appreciate the conversation. This was excellent.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.